Hello and welcome. Hi everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to welcome Aura Satz, who will be showing and discussing her work today. And it's a pleasure to be hosting this event with Harriet Loeffler, who's the curator of the New Hall Art Collection, a collection of art by women. And in a moment, Harriet will introduce Aura, but first a few words from myself. My name is Mina, Gorji, and I'm part of the Auralities network here at CRASSH, here in the University of Cambridge. We're a group of researchers and writers and performers who are interested in practices of listening in different disciplines and in different spaces and institutions. We're exploring the different kinds of listening in film, in music, in forests, in hospitals, in sacred places and traditions. And today we're thinking about sound art. Aura's work does so much to defamiliarize the experience of listening, to recalibrate our listening and open up a more capacious experience, a kind of feminist practice, which I think she's going to talk about today. And you can find out more about Aura's work and listen to clips if you go to the CRASSH webpage for this event. We've put some clips. You may have done so already. We'd like to welcome you to the discussion today. We're really excited to welcome so many new names and voices to join the conversation, and we're really looking forward to hearing questions at the end of Aura's talk. Aura will speak for about an hour, and there'll be time for questions and discussion after that for about half an hour. So we'll end at about 4 o'clock. So do please put questions in the chat as they arise, and we'll come to those after the talk. One request, we are recording this, so we'd be really grateful if you could please put yourself on mute for the duration of the talk, certainly. Thanks again for coming along today, and thanks again to Aura and to Harriet, and I'll hand over to Harriet now.
Thank you so much, Mina. An absolute pleasure to be working with you on this event. It's actually the second event that we've done together as part of the Auralities Research Network, so it's really great to sort of continue the discussion. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Aura to this event today. So Aura's work encompasses film, sound, performance, and sculpture. Her work centres on the trope of ventriloquism in order to conceptualise a distributed, expanded, and shared notion of voice. Works are made in conversation and use dialogue as both method and subject matter. Satz has made a body of work centred on various sound technologies in order to explore notation systems, code and encryption, and ways in which these might resist standardisation, generating new soundscapes and in turn new forms of listening and attending to the other. She has performed, exhibited and screened her work nationally and internationally, including Tate Modern, the BFI in Southbank, the New York Film Festival, Tate Britain, Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art, the Hayward Gallery, the Sydney Biennial, Lentos Museum in Linz, SF MoMA in San Francisco, and Sharjah Art Foundation, among many others. She has presented solo exhibitions at the Wellcome Collection in London, the Hayward Gallery Project Space, the John Hansard Gallery in Southampton, Dallas Contemporary in Texas. And from 2009 to 10, she was artist in residence at the EAR Institute at UCL in London, which was funded by the Wellcome Trust. In 2012, she was shortlisted for the Samsung Art Plus Award and the Jarman Award. And between 2015 and 2016, she was awarded a Leverhulme Artists Residency, and her films can be seen and are distributed by Lux. So I'm thrilled to be in the company of such a wonderful artist, really grateful that you could be here, and take it away. Aura, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really pleased to be with you in some way. I know that we had planned this last year in person in Cambridge, and now I'm in my bedroom on a screen, but that's the way of the world at the moment. So I thought, following on from your invitation, that I would address a kind of strand of my practice that looks at, I suppose, listening through a kind of feminist lens. And I'm going to kind of run through a series of works. I'm going to change it a little bit because for the most part I tend to kind of I think my works work in constellations and they tell a story in the way that they kind of unfold, one follows through to the next. But today I've changed the order a bit, so we're going to see how this works. Partly Harriet asked me to talk about a specific piece of work, which I will do. So I'm going to share my screen. Just a sec. Can you see that? Yeah, okay. So I wanted to start with this piece, which I often do. This is a piece that was kind of really seminal in the work I've been doing with sound, and I first did it when I was pregnant in 2003, and it was called Ventriloquism. And I suppose what I find really useful about it is that it sets the tone for what Harriet was saying in her introduction to my work around this idea of a kind of ventriloquial trope. So the idea of being spoken through and speaking through is really important to me. I'm really interested in kind of exploding this idea of where the voice sits and who is speaking and authorship and where listening takes place. And so for me, this piece was, I suppose, the first iteration of this in a really embodied way. And I wanted to quote the feminist scholar Sara Ahmed, who writes about a citational logic, because I really feel that this resonates with this idea. But I came across this quote the other day and I hadn't even clocked that there was this kind of alignment. So she says, "I would describe citation as a rather successful reproductive technology, a way of reproducing the world around certain bodies." So I'm going to play a tiny clip. And as you can see, so there's a belly and the pregnant person is holding onto a theremin, which is an electronic musical instrument that plays the ether, as it were. It plays the electromagnetic airwaves without touch. And in this case, the body becomes the antenna or the medium or the conduit through which to kind of play this piece of music or sound. And what really struck me is, rather than this idea of a kind of fertile female body, you know, this body that is holding another body inside of it in this kind of essentialist way of a kind of reproductive logic in that sense, what really appealed to me was the idea that for a brief moment I was a container of another voice, very physically, but that this was a kind of metaphor for how I understand voices more generally, and this idea of a kind of porous space where the body is permeable, authorship is permeable, and there's a kind of shared collective space for voices that we need to tune into and activate and think about. And so in this piece I was really, I suppose, doing that in a very kind of first-hand embodied way. I'll let it play for a moment. So I suppose the other thing that that particular piece kind of allows me to address, and this is partly in response to Harriet's invitation, is this idea of a close-up listening, or of bringing into speech, or of thinking of, you know, surfaces, subjects, objects, as a space for latent or potential voicing, potential sonification. And so sometimes things are audible and sometimes they're kind of brought into speech, or we need to face towards them, or, you know, cup our ear and kind of practice a kind of auscultation, you know, close-up listening. And that kind of mode of attention, which I think of in an ethical sense of like leaning towards elsewhere, other, not the self, or not the necessarily audible, is something I really hold on to throughout my work in one way or another. So this piece is, it's a sound piece that uses a phonograph horn, quite a large one, and then you put your head in it. So there was a drawing giving people a license to do so, and you can see here in an exhibition, and as I was composing it, and inside the horn there are 5 small speakers kind of all around your head, like a crown almost. And so when you put your head in it, you kind of hear this spatialized close-up surround sound, and it's quite disorienting. Obviously you don't see anything, and it tapped into a kind of parallel project, which is almost the inverse, so similar principle of a horn, but in this case I put these hearing trumpets inside, so a kind of old-fashioned hearing device to amplify sounds for someone hard of hearing was kind of flipped on its head to become a device for broadcasting, or playback. And again, they were 10 different sounds, and so you kind of had to walk around it. So this idea of a kind of very spatialized experience where you're listening, but there is no ideal sweet spot. The experience is different according to, well, in many ways it would be different anyway, according to your hearing ability, which, as we know, beyond kind of oral diversity, so people with different hearing capacities, like that happens anyway. Young children hear higher frequencies, older people hear less higher frequencies. If you have, damage from loud noises, you have a different range of hearing. So there is no kind of ideal vantage point, ideal listening sweet spot. It's always changing, and that's kind of something that I think the works aim to enact physically, so that you become aware of this, but also think about more productively. So when I was talking earlier about an idea of expanding listening, of thinking of listening to things that we wouldn't usually pay attention to. So there's noise and there's signal. So right now there's the background noise of the traffic or whatever, and I'm speaking, so my voice is the signal. So there's a kind of attention economy whereby we choose to listen to certain things and block out other sounds, but ultimately there's a whole realm of sound that we can choose where we want to put our focus. And sometimes that is, again, a kind of ethical choice of, like, if you think of it beyond the actual acoustic experience of listening, if you think of it more ethically, like which voices are we understanding as signal and which voices are noise or background noise, and how do we shift that focal point? So I'm gonna, sorry this is a little bit messy, but some of the films, if I put them into a PowerPoint, they stagger and they don't play well. So I'm gonna just kind of flip between the different screen modes. So this is a very recent film I made about a Argentine electroacoustic composer, Beatriz Ferreira, based in France. And this is part of a series of works I've made that are kind of portraits of sorts of women composers. And I'm really interested in the way in which I understand their practices as recalibrating, as setting up a different kind of listening, a different mode of understanding the soundscape. So inventing new sounds, stretching or pulling, or instantiating a new sound from nothing, if it's in the case of synthetic sounds. And this in turn, so it brings about, it instantiates a new kind of sound language, a new soundscape, and in turn a new form of listening. So I'm just going to play the opening bit. And the reason I want to play this bit is because, sorry, it's in Spanish with subtitles, just to make it clear. So she's illustrating this kind of attentive listening to a door creak.
No puedo parar ahí. Le di una forma. Otra formita. Ahora una trama, variada, continua, con variaciones. todavía el sonido. Bueno, esa es una toma de sonido, esa es una grabación personal. Otra persona hará otra cosa. Por eso que es tan importante las grabaciones, porque cada compositor tiene su manera de... A lo mejor a alguien no le interesa nada esta corta. Yo no sé lo que voy a hacer con ella, pero un día quizás necesito ese sonido para hacer no sé qué. O sea que al mismo tiempo somos chasseurs de son, donde dice... somos cazadores de sonido.
So I really love that moment. It was quite magic with her because, as I said, she's an electroacoustic composer, so she works with tape recording particularly, and then manipulates it, stretches it, slows it down, plays it backward, and so forth. And that idea of like taking the existing sound world and kind of doing something to it in order to listen closer, which is really what she's doing. And in her compositions is very spatialized, which is something she talks about later on. But I suppose in many of these conversations that I've done with women composers, and not exclusively, but some of them are of a certain generation, so the beginning of electronic music, you know, working in the 60s and 70s, what I find that they're doing is really kind of putting forward a new way of listening. And that door, that creaky door, what that does, it's a kind of portrait of a compositional process of sorts in which she's widening the bandwidth. And that's really what I'm interested in when I talked about close-up listening or amplification. This idea that, as I said earlier, there's like, you know, like there's a door. So it's not just binary open shut. You know, there's a million ways in which you can play this door musically and think of it and expand the way in which you pay attention to it. And so I hold on to that. I found that really, again, sometimes through the encounter that the artwork enables me to kind of make, to have. Something is articulated that I was searching for, and I find that that door scene is a very good way of understanding this idea of kind of widening the bandwidth of the portal, you know, of the portal of attention. The other piece that I wanted to show that's connected to this is much earlier, and it's a film about the electronic music pioneer and inventor Daphne Oram. And so she came up with this device called the Aramix machine. And really what it is a new form of sound writing.
Music.
I'll just play it for a bit and then I'll talk over it.
Aramix, the new graphic sound. We'll muse upon sound, music and electronics in the hope that we'll catch a scent or two of intriguing interrelationships between these subjects. We're going to enter a strange world. And we're going to find composers will be mingling with capacitors. Transistors are going to be transmuting triplets. And perchance, metaphysics may creep in to mate memory, music, and magnetism in some strange sort of eternal triangle.
So, as I said, Daphne Oram wasn't just a composer. I mean, she started off working at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, but essentially she had this fantasy of the Aramics machine that she eventually managed to kind of manifest and make into the world, which used graphic notation, sonified it, and kind of, rather than as with the work of Beatrice Ferreira I showed a moment ago, where she makes a sound recording and then does something to it. In this case, she kind of magicked sounds from nothing. So the sound didn't pre-exist. It was brought into being through this Aramics machine. And so to do this, she had to kind of work in a very intuitive way of figuring out this new sound alphabet. And so, as you can see, she did these kind of inscriptions on 35mm clear film that are then kind of using a similar principle to optical sound on film, but more complex than that. She sonified these sound envelopes or the vibrato, and so it's a new notation system in itself. And I found this really potent as an idea. So if we're going to align this with a kind of feminist position, it's almost as if to say the existing alphabet, the existing language, the existing sound world that we have is insufficient to manifest the language and the words, and the world and the kind of, I suppose, the semantic field that she wanted to bring into being. And so she kind of had to make it from scratch, instantiate it. And I found this really powerful. So going back to this idea of listening and recalibrating, and kind of aligning that with a specific practice. If you think about the history of music, it was a particularly male-dominated area, and with electronic music, there's a kind of democratization in that, it's you don't need an orchestra to play your pieces, so you could write, a very sophisticated composition, but it would be hard to find an orchestra who would play it. With electronic music in the 60s and 70s, that process is democratized and new doors are open specifically to women, but also other people from different backgrounds. And so, Daphne Oram was working on different iterations of this invention, and one of them was a kind of version with, I think it was baking paper. So it would be very domestic, very easy to use. I don't think that part of her invention went ahead, but, this idea that you could be, and in fact, Eliane Radig, who's the composer I made the most recent sound piece that I believe was shared with you, there was a moment in which she, as a parent with children, she was composing in her kitchen. So this idea that somehow music making, and I say music because that's the field I've been looking at, but I've also done works around women in science and other forms of knowledge and knowledge production and knowledge circulation. The idea that somehow certain doors become open and certain possibilities are suddenly activated is really fascinating. Point at which something new can be instantiated. And in other works that I've made around, say, Laurie Spiegel, who worked with early programming, if you think code is another form of inventing a new language in order to manifest, I'm going to say new sounds, but it's a kind of new language in effect. So just going back to, just going back to this. So, so I was talking about this idea of kind of close-up listening and opening the bandwidth and kind of making new sounds possible. And I think, especially in relation to women, there's a kind of very particular reading that when you take away from the equation the body, like the female body is making those sounds, something different happens, something different becomes possible. And in fact, a lot of the early electronic music that these women were composing, whether it's Delia Derbyshire, that you probably know through Doctor Who, or Daphne Oram, or other composers later on, it was kind of inevitably associated with sci-fi or horror films. So this idea of like a body that we don't know, that's unfamiliar, that's from the future, or that's alien, or that's horrifying. And that is really, I find that really powerful as well. There's a threat around this unknown voice that comes from a body we can't recognize. So moving on to this idea of like making an existing sound somewhat unfamiliar, I did this piece, I was asked to make a piece for telephone, which is slightly different to the ear trumpet or the kind of close-up listening, but there is something there still around like eavesdropping, or, you know, hearing another mouth straight into your ear, which is effectively what the telephone does. And so I invited two of my hero composers, Pauline Oliveros, who I draw on a lot in her philosophy of deep listening, and Laurie Spiegel, to have a conversation about the dial tone. So the dial tone is this note, a kind of electronic signal, you know, beep, that says the line is open, you can make your call now. Obviously now with mobile phones it's slightly different, but we still have a busy tone or whatever. So we have these kind of set agreements around what the sound signifies. And what I found interesting about it was that the dial tone as a kind of metaphor for ideas of connection, communication, transmission, but also sustained notes, so composing with a note that doesn't change, so a drone, effectively. And I'll just play a tiny bit because it's quite a long piece.
What is a conversation? $350 hertz plus 440 hertz. Those are the frequencies that are mixed together to give you the dial tone. I think I used the dial tone in some piece of mine. I can't remember when. Now, but it's ringing a bell.
The dial tone. It ought to sound like an invitation. It's a complex signal, but it's kind of raunchy and ugly. It indicates the potential of a communication because it shows that you have signal, but it also gives time pressure because if you don't do anything for long enough, you get some kind of a message saying that you've dialed a wrong number, or there's a miscommunication, or there's something wrong with the line, or some kind of a message saying time's up.
From the time we're born, we're optimized for speech. And so that our attention then is focused toward learning to communicate, you know, and learning the sounds of communication, which is speech. There's another kind of attention, which is what I call global or inclusive attention, where you include as much sound as you can and understand the field of sound and understand place or environment or where you are while you're maybe busy communicating.
What does it mean to be connected? That's a good question. The first thing that comes to my mind is how tenuous connectedness is, how fragile, how easily connections are broken, whether they're electronic or emotional or in any other way. And there's also the fact that many connections are brief, transitory, and not very deep. So I think of connection as a state of vulnerability.
Sorry, that was a bit abrupt. I should have faded it. Yeah, so the piece is 14 minutes, and it starts off with Pauline, who, those of you who are familiar with her, her instrument was the accordion, and often she would sing with the accordion. So that's the first sound. It sounds a bit like a dial tone, but actually it's the accordion, and then her voice comes in. And then later the piece kind of addresses all these different facets of sustained notes, a listening practice, a composing practice, and thinking of this in relation to telecommunications and being in communication, because we recorded it all over telephone. And the same with the recent piece that I made with Eliane Radig, who's again one of the great electronic music composers, but in the last 20 years she's shifted from working with electronic sounds and moved to work with acoustic instruments. So in the piece that I made, it's with Rodri Davis, who plays the harp, and Julia Eckert, who plays the viola. And in that case, the transmission is a conversation. So it's literally, there's no score, there's no form of writing. It's a conversation about an image of water, and that informs how they then play. So it's very, very ephemeral and personal and about connection. And yeah, one of the things that Eliane says that's really beautiful is this idea that, you know, the whole world is vibration, and, you know, we're just not hearing it. And so she thinks of her music as a kind of cutout, a little momentary sonification, or kind of bringing to attention, bringing vibration into enough friction that you start to hear it. And so this idea that the sound composition is a kind of momentary capture of this is really beautiful. And likewise in this piece, in Dial Tone Drone, Laurie says later on that one of the things that's really fascinating about working with sustained notes, so with a continuous sound, is that the mind habituates to the lack of change. So, you know, if you just hear a tone all the time, you kind of get used to it. So what happens is the mind gets bored, so to speak, and it does the thing I was talking about earlier, where it kind of opens up the bandwidth and allows other smaller sounds in, much more finer detail. And so you get into this state where you're listening to tiny, tiny shifts. And so I think there's a way in which we can either set the intention to operate in that way, or sometimes through music, sound, or other forms of experience, you know, that can be induced in us. And I'm interested in exploring both of those things. So these are just a few images that kind of maybe illustrate the ways in which I've worked with sound and kind of exploded the sound in relation to the film. So this is a piece about sound inscriptions on acetate, so wax cylinders and vinyl, and this idea of sound writing. It's quite a complex piece. I'm not going to go into detail here, but the way in which I showed it in this particular context, so it's a film with its own soundtrack, but here it was exploded into this multi-channel sound piece, and there were also some hearing trumpets. So there's like big sounds, small sounds, and it's kind of broken up, and there's no ideal sweet spot in which to listen to it. Slightly different, but similar principle here. This was a sound film installation, and to see the film you were meant to kind of stand inside this sphere with 32 different speakers, and the sound was very spatialized. So it kind of does something to the situatedness of your body, of being a body listening to a film. This is a piece I made last year, which was an invitation to work with some astrophysicists who are speculating on the idea of dark matter. And, you know, this is the kind of great mystery. 95% of the universe is invisible to us, so it's not apparent. And dark matter is the theory that holds it together. And what really interested me was one metaphor that I read about, you know, many different scientific experiments trying to understand what dark matter is, what it's made from, how it operates, how it moves in the world and affects us. And one of them was that, you know, we have a radio station, and we know there's a frequency, but we haven't found it. So we're busy kind of trying to find that frequency. And I really loved that idea. So the piece was called Dark Matter Radio. And again, there are 10 speakers, so it's like a speaker ring. You stand inside of it. Each speaker is playing a different tone based on a simulation of how dark matter moves, which is very kind of water-like, like ripples in the sea or in a swimming pool. And so as you move through it, each person will hear it very differently. And you're kind of in this, what I called a kind of acoustic moire, you know, a series of like interference patterns that you're inside of, that's kind of rippling, and sometimes it's dense, sometimes it's more spacious. This was a piece I did in collaboration with the filmmaker Liz Rhodes, and I suppose this piece really set up the idea of a conversation as a starting point. So Liz taught me many years ago, and we stayed friends, and then collaborated on this piece in 2012, and have since been working on other works together, and are always in conversation. And I really felt that the conversation was so precious to me, the conversations that we had in person, and I couldn't ever take notes, because a bit like what I was describing with Eliane Radig's work with her musicians, which by the way is a modular piece, so she's been working on that work with many different musicians. Sometimes 3 musicians are together, sometimes it's an orchestra, sometimes it's just one. But that idea of like a conversation, and then what can you distill, or what can you hold on to and carry forward in the conversation. So Liz and I met and then distilled this into a conversation of sorts that was composed, and then voiced it together. And then it was run through an optical sound camera. So when I mentioned earlier the optical sound at the side strip of an analog film strip, it kind of visualizes the sound, you know, a bit like on a computer, you'd have a kind of sound wave. So it visualizes it. But I went inside the machine and tried to kind of disorient the way in which sound and image are synchronized or pulled apart. And so again, it's about trying to induce and suggest a different kind of listening and looking experience. In this case, it was an expanded film performance. So there was a device called a Rubens tube, which visualizes sound as a standing row of flames, so fire, and that responded to the sound of live music. And the light from the flame device and the light from the film, so both of them have a form of sound as light, but they were flickering up against each other and sometimes cancelling each other out. So that idea of interference, which is the other side of like a conversation, or coming together of voices, but also voices that maybe sometimes are not necessarily harmonious, or that they're kind of working in tension with each other, was really interesting. And it made me think of this idea of like a conversation as the starting point for a composition. These are really difficult to document. So these are a series of drawings called She Recalibrates, and they're all of some of these women composers that I've worked with, that I mentioned earlier, and others that I haven't had the opportunity to meet, or that have passed away. I just wanted to show this really briefly because so they're drawings on black paper done in pencil, so that's why they're almost impossible to document. But they are framed inside a lenticular lens, so the lens moves as you move. So there's a little video clip here. It's really hard to see properly, but maybe this gives you some idea. So the reflection moves with the hand, and the hand is on a dial. So going back to that idea of listening out for something that you don't quite know what it is. So we, you know, if we think of the radio as a metaphor, you know, we're looking for a channel, but in my case, I'm not interested in finding the channel. I'm interested in the in-between space, and in that kind of experimental listening that comes about. And in this case, a lot of these women working with electronic interfaces, you know, modular synthesizers, they had a little dial. And I loved the images of them composing were often them kind of with one ear poised and the hand on the dial. And there's a kind of feedback loop in the photo, which shows the compositional process of listening in this experimental way, listening in a way in which we don't know where the sound is going to take us. It's not like on the keyboard of a piano where we know what each note is meant to sound like. There's no, or there isn't necessarily a pre-existing sound that they're after. It's something exploratory and tentative, and that's something I find really special. I'm going to end, I've got another 15 minutes or so. I'm going to end by talking about a project that is really, I'm quite obsessive about this project. I've been working on it for a very long time now. And it came out of, in part, the dial tone piece, so the piece around the telephone sound signal, so a familiar electronic sound signal. We know what it means. It allows us to do something. It tells us, for example, that we can make a telephone call. At the other end of the spectrum, so this sound that is all about connection and kind of finding each other, connecting, weaving together voices. On the other side of that is the siren, so the emergency signal, which at the moment is predominantly an electronic signal, but originally would have been an acoustic kind of wind-up sound. And that sound is a call to action. It's a sound that's telling us there's an emergency, get out of the way, or, well, it depends. You know, there's the civil siren, so there's big emergency sounds for collective action, you know, go and hide in the cellar or in the bunker, or there's a flood or a tsunami. But what I find interesting about this, and I suppose that goes back to my idea of a kind of setting the intention for a certain kind of listening, or opening up pre-existing listening habits and thinking about them afresh. And especially now, because it feels like the world is in crisis. The world is, especially now, we're in between a kind of suspended animation because of the pandemic and an extreme state of emergency. But I've been working on this project for the last 4 years, and it's felt like the siren has been the soundtrack, my mental soundtrack of like a sense of constant ramping up of the sense of emergency. And again, going back to what I said earlier about sound, kind of signal, background noise and signal, like which are the emergencies we're paying attention to, which are the ones that are worthy of our attention, and which ones are kind of background noise, which are the ones we don't even have a sound to signal. So climate change is, you know, a huge emergency of slow violence, slow and systemic violence. It might not have the one sound that can hold it together and signal that to us, but also that we know what to do, like what's the course of action, the response. So when I made the drawings of She Recalibrates, I also made this sound sculpture which uses 5 hand-wound sirens, and they're each wound to a different RPM, or rotation per minute, or a different tone. And the intention was that people kind of interact with it and wind it and kind of dissect this siren sound, which actually, when you play it very slowly, can be maybe more soothing, less kind of terrifying, or it can be growly and kind of animal-like. And so just all the different registers of this sound, and people can engage in some kind of exploratory listening and playing through it. So it's a musical instrument of sorts, using a siren. But as I've been working on this project and thinking about it, to go back to the idea of the dial tone, so, you know, that's an existing sound. What I really want to do is break away from the existing siren that is familiar to us, that we've inherited from World War I, World War II, current emergency vehicles, so ambulances, police cars. It's no longer an efficient sound. You know, we're not hearing it. The world is very noisy. It's becoming increasingly noisy. The acoustic ecology is completely, you know, there's fatigue on all fronts. There's particularly alarm fatigue. And if you think about it, like everything is ringing a bell or sounding an alarm, you know, your seatbelt in your car, your mobile phone, you know, everything is communicating to us through these little beeps and sirens or other kinds of sound. And what what I want to do with this project, rather than look backwards and kind of think archivally, so in many of my previous works, I've looked at a kind of history, a history of music or history of certain technologies or astronomy or ballistics, warfare. And I've tried to kind of redress the canon. So bring in, I'm going to say voices for want of a better metaphor, but, you know, bring in the voices that haven't been heard and think differently about like noise and signal, who gets to be part of the canon. But with this project, what I'm trying to do is get into the mindset of that kind of early experimental listening that I was talking about with the kind of prehistory of electronic music. And if the siren didn't exist, because the one we have now is inefficient in many ways. On the one hand, we're not hearing it. So I've been speaking to different people from, you know, like nuclear power plants. Yeah, I mean, there's tons of different ways in which people aren't hearing the sound signal. So they're trying to invent a new low frequency siren called the rumbler that you will feel before you hear it. So even that idea of like a vibrational listening or listening away from the ears, because our ears, one person I was talking to, she was saying that noise is now like microplastic, like acoustic pollution is completely overwhelming. And it's very hard, our state of attention, much like, you know, we're on screen and in a state of constant kind of attention distraction. That's kind of what's happening with our ears. And so we still need to communicate emergencies, but the way in which emergency is being instrumentalized at the moment and used is A, inefficient, B, politically manipulative and problematic. And I suppose the kind of third point that I'm trying to address is the affect of it, the kind of mode of communication that it suggests is this very kind of heightened, panicky, frantic, inefficient sound signal. And so I've invited different musicians to think of new siren sounds and to think with me collectively to kind of try to invent a new sound. If we were starting from scratch, would it be quiet? Could it be gentle? Could it be, someone I was talking to who's a cognitive psychologist who works with the design of emergency sounds. In particular, she was looking at hospitals and all of the technology there, which, you know, everything is beeping, the machine that checks your heart rate, or, you know, and so people working in those contexts are incredibly stressed because everything is just going beep, beep, beep. And so she was saying that that needs rethinking in a very kind of pragmatic way, and also that the way in which we semantically configure, you know, a sound to something that's being to the signifier. So, for example, a heart monitoring device, you know, that it doesn't need to sound like a beep. It could sound more like a heart, or, you know, and if you think about anyone who's got a newborn child or a small animal or any, you know, like we are attuned to small sounds as well. We hear small sounds if we choose to. You know, my phone is pretty much always on vibrate and I hear it, and that's a small sound. I feel it. So I suppose what this film is about, this project, I've already made bits of it, but it's a long-term feature film. It's about thinking around the kind of affect of an emergency sound and taking all of the things I've said up until now around a kind of feminist way of like, okay, the existing sounds we have are not working, or they're insufficient, or they don't take us where we could go if we had the imagination and the capacious, you know, the kind of open mind to get there. And so we're in this state of like constant emergency that feels totally apocalyptic. And they're all intersecting, you know, the slow violence of climate change, the rising fascism, nuclear leaks, other kind of natural disasters. And it feels like what we need is to kind of change some of these signals, or at least to think about them productively. And then maybe our capacity to cope will be somewhat enhanced or improved. That's kind of very ambitious hypothesis. but also to think about this question of temporality. So outside of the way in which emergency signals operate right now, which is, there's an immediate danger, you need an immediate signal, and you need an immediate course of action, which, by the way, for the most part, if there was like some nuclear attack or something, like even if we heard a siren now, other than being completely freaked out, like would we know what to do? Are the instructions even clear? And if you think about the pandemic, there was no warning, there was no preemptive kind of preparation. Once it's there, we don't understand it. We don't understand what the course of action is. So I feel like this piece is really, in some ways, it kind of draws on everything I've said up until now, but it locates it within a very grounded political and ecological and socio-political emergency we find ourselves in. And it's about, when I said earlier about like trying to instantiate a new language, I'm trying to propose, even if it's speculative, and it is speculative, it's imaginative, but it's not that far from the truth. It's not totally far-fetched sci-fi, it's actually a kind of very real, grounded moment that we're experiencing. And obviously in the last few months since the pandemic, this piece has taken on different readings. But I suppose, to think about how we communicate, and sound is one portal, one material that I'm using to think about this. It's not the only one, but I just maybe want to reiterate that the piece is not a kind of account of how sirens have functioned up until now. I mean, that's information I'm giving you, but it's a hopeful reimagining of the siren sound. That's what I want it to do. And I want it to be hopeful because, as I said earlier, about setting the intention, I want it to put us in a position where we feel more able to cope and more able to listen also to perhaps the voices or the voices calling out, from a distance that aren't being heard, and whether that's animals on the cusp of extinction. So one of the sirens that I have Laurie Spiegel composed is precisely about animal sounds and that idea of kind of the howl and the growl and the cry, and the siren has all of those registers. But then another sound composition by Elaine Mitchener is very quiet, and it sounds like someone far at sea. It's very soft and quiet, but it's also evocative of the sirens in the mythological sense. So this kind of female voice that's in the kind of big wide open expanse of the sea. Rodri Davis, the harpist I mentioned with Ileana Radig, has made a really beautiful harp siren sound. I've got cello siren sounds, electronic siren sounds, and more to come. And I think on that note, I will stop. Thank you very much.